Yes. And not right now.
May I have your attention, please? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce to you this lecture, and I greet you with the greetings of Islam. Assalamu alaikum. Normally, as a Muslim, every speech that we started with saying Alhamdulillah, which means thanks to God. So I thank God that allowed us the chance to be with Dr. Siddiqui here, and I hope that this lecture will be useful to all of us and will contribute to our understanding of Islam and the contribution of Islam to modern science and technology. We're happy to have Dr. Siddiqui with us here. His full name is Dr. Dilnawaz Ahmed Siddiqui. Dilnawaz Ahmed Siddiqui. He was born in India in July 4th, 1937. So most probably he's the oldest among us over here. Where he has his BA, MA degree, and Bachelor in Education degrees, and from Aligarh Muslim University in India. Then he got his postgraduate diploma in education from London University in England, and then came to the United States here and got his PhD in educational communication from Syracuse University in New York. He worked with the Canadian International Development Agency, with the USAID. He also worked as the chief U.S. advisor to Yemen, and he is right now professor of communication in Clarion University of Pennsylvania. May I request you to please come over here, Dr. Siddiq? And you forgive me, I'll be around over here, so if you need any help, let me know. Thank you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum. Those who do not understand Arabic should not be under the impression that I'm going to make the speech, the entire speech, in this language. Don't be afraid. We'll communicate, inshallah. Okay. The translation of the quotation from the Quran can be translated because this is really relevant to what I'm going to talk about for quite some time this evening, inshallah. And that is, O Lord, open up my heart, my chest, and facilitate my task at hand, and solve the knot of my tongue, or loosen the knot of my tongue, and make my ideas understandable, or logical and rational. This can serve as a kind of prayer to God, which I have already made to him, and it can also serve as a kind of brief introduction to the entire subject at hand, that there is a compatibility, according to Islam, between revelation and reason. If you ask a Christian, what is the ultimate purpose of life of a human being, the answer is spiritual salvation. If you ask a Buddhist or a Hindu, what is the ultimate purpose of human life, the answer is spiritual salvation. If you ask a Muslim, and that Muslim knows Islam, the same question, what is the ultimate purpose of human life, the answer is slightly different. And that is to establish a judicious and just societal order here on earth. And now and here we are supposed to contribute toward the establishment of such a society. If we bear in mind this definition of Islamic purpose, we can also understand why Muslims these days are regarded as crazy people. Because if you ask anybody belonging to any other religion than Islam, he will say that his or her religion is not capable of helping resolve the problems in the field of economics, in the field of society, or in the field of politics. Whereas a Muslim crazily, quote unquote, insists that Islam has the answers to not only the problems of society, economy, or politics, but it has got answers to the problems of non-Muslims also, provided they try to understand Islam through the main sources, authentic sources. That's the Quran, that's the Hadith. That is reliable, authentic history. Islam, by that definition, unfortunately, is the most misunderstood way of life or religion for various reasons. And we'll come to some of those reasons. So what is the rationale this evening for me to present this topic, that is contribution of Muslims to science and technology? If you ask someone, what was the fastest means of communication at the time of Alexander the Great, the answer is horse. If you ask the same question, what was the fastest means of communication at the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, the French, the answer is the same. The answer is horse. And the time between these 2 points of time of history, as it were, the span, is about 2,000 years. So you can understand that, more than 2,000 years. We can thereby understand the slow progress in the field of knowledge, in the field of science, which had taken place prior to that. And that's understandable in view of the fact that humanity may have taken millennia in discovering fire, may have taken millennia, thousands of years, in discovering wheel. Humanity may have taken, I do not know how many years, in inventing the buttonhole right in your shirt. We don't know. So if we ask the same question now, what was the means of communication, or you can say fastest means of communication 10 years ago? The answer would be different from the answer to the question asked today. If you ask what is the fastest means of communication today, that would be different entirely from the time, say, 10 years ago. So the point which I'm trying to make here is that we are supposed to place the contributions of Muslims to science and technology in its proper historical context. That during the time when the world was making such slow, tortoise pace or progress, you can say, what were the Muslims doing? What were the contributions of Muslims at that particular time? So we are supposed to search for true origins of the so-called Western science and technology and Western education system, and that you will not find anywhere but in the contributions of Muslims themselves. We are also expected in modern times to correct the enormous gap in the Western historical account of human history, especially the history of human progress. We also are supposed to establish and promote a healthy competitive climate in a cooperative, not adversarial spirit of one humanity. These are some of the rationales as to why we should talk about the contributions of Muslims to science and technology. We, Muslims and non-Muslims, are supposed to collectively work toward the establishment of a just and peaceful order in mutual and multicultural climate. We also are supposed to stalk off misinformation and media sensationalism about other nations, particularly Muslims. We are also supposed to enable ourselves as Americans and American citizens and those who are interested in American way of life to interact effectively with the rest of the world. And that we cannot do unless we understand other cultures in the true sense of the word. If we try to understand Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists or Christians from unauthentic sources, then we will not be able to form the right impression at all. And we will always be victim of propaganda. And the result will be that we'll be perceived as different. And different is bad, right? And bad deserves to be punished. And that punishment can generate needless wars, as we have seen in recent years. So it is this motivation on my part that we should really talk about the cultural contribution, scientific contribution in various disciplines by Muslims. So what are some of the reasons for those misunderstandings? Let me go into that a bit, very briefly, before I come to the actual contributions themselves. I hope you will bear with me when I talk about this by way of setting a kind of climate or a context in which we have to place the contributions of Muslims to science and technology. Our own, first of all, Muslims should blame themselves that they have not been as forward-looking in non-spiritual fields as the Quran enjoins them to do. They, somehow or the other, have been preoccupied too much with this spiritual aspect, the mistakes which I see in other cultures, the overemphasis, historically speaking, on the spiritual part, which I mentioned earlier on. The second thing was, as to why this misunderstanding became very common, was the loss of political power by Muslims, some kind of decline since the 15th century, and Muslims were put on the defensive all the time. And a nation which is on the defensive does not make any progress, does not in actual fact contribute, because he or she, the individual of that particular community, is preoccupied with security in the hierarchy of Maslow. All right? You cannot be anywhere near self-actualization or making contribution in the true sense of the word. After the 15th century, only the isolated empires of Muslims survived, like the Ottoman Empire, like the Mughal empires. And we should always remember that the laurels of the past cannot be lived on very effectively. We can simply mention them for a purpose, which I have just mentioned, to clarify some of the misunderstandings, but we cannot continue being as lax as we have been. So obviously, Europe was on the march, chasing Muslims out of the scene for several centuries during the last 300, 400 years. Another reason why these misunderstandings persist even today is the anti-Muslim rumors since Crusades, unfortunately. They have still survived. That kind of impression has percolated into curricula, into history, and into various other means of communication. These rumors against Muslims or their contributions were re-intensified during European colonialism, and there were, of course, some light somewhere, and that came actually from honest Christians and honest Jewish scholars themselves, who mentioned in extolling terms the contributions of Muslims to science and technology. And some of the examples are Philip Hitti, or one Jewish scholar whose name I cannot remember at the moment, who wrote The History of Medicine, and he mentioned the contribution of Muslims. His History of the Arabs was by Philip Hitti, and History of Science was, or Medical Sciences, was by that gentleman. Another source was by George Sarton, and the name of that book is Philosophy of the History of Science. He was a professor in Harvard University, and he has written a lot on the subject of philosophy of science, history of the philosophy of science, and he devotes quite a lot of pages to the contributions of science and science and technology by Muslims. Then, unfortunately, since the establishment of Israel in 1948, those Jewish scholars who used to extol the contribution of Muslims prior to that event became slightly biased, and they did not continue in that honest tradition. And that became more intensified after the 1967 war, when people like Bernard Lewis, who used to extol the history of Muslims, they started writing articles, the latest of which was prior to this Gulf War, in early part of the 1990, which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly by the title of The Muslim Rage. And the essential point of that article was that there is no possibility, or there is no hope of any kind of reconciliation between scientifically minded West, advanced civilization of the West, and these Muslims, as if they had nothing to do with science and with civilization and culture. So these were some of the organized campaigns, political campaigns, which have distorted the truth with regard to the true history. And some of the recent attempts by Muslims themselves in this regard have been very positive, like, for example, by Mehdi Nakhustin, who came up about 25 years ago. He was a professor in the University of Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, and he wrote a book by the name of The History of Modern Education, Near Eastern Contributions to Western Education. And he really wrote a fantastic volume, and if you happen to have that in your library, we'll be fortunate, because that's not a very publicized volume. In the same way, you have Sayyid Qutb, who wrote the Islam, the Misunderstood Religion. Another Iranian wrote Sayyid Hussein Nasr, whose picture you saw perhaps when you were trying to set that or queuing that tape. Abdul Wahid Yusuf from Sudan wrote an article from the University of Toronto proving that the tradition of lifelong learning comes out of the ahadith of Prophet ﷺ and from the Quranic insistence on knowledge. And that was defended in 1978 in the University of Toronto under the Canadian professor Dr. Kidd. In 1970, Maurice Bucaille, in actual fact, also came up with a book, Bible, Quran, and Science, that tried to do some justice to this fact. And at the same time, tapes by Jamal Badawi mention quite a lot about the contributions of Muslims to science and technology. Since the oil embargo in 1973 and Islamic revolution in 1979 and anti-Iraq preparation for this Gulf War in 1988, those positive steps which were taken by some scholars in correcting those mistakes, unfortunately they were reversed by the anti-propaganda, anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim propaganda, unfortunately. So some of the most recent attempts are by Smithsonian Institution, which has come up with a tape by the name of Islam, and I'm going to share only a segment of that very soon, inshallah. And the other one is, which everyone should really buy that book and should try to present to both their children and others. That's a book by James Burke, and the name of the book is The Day the Universe Changed. And James Burke, who is a commentator of British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, London, he has devoted scores of pages to the contribution of science and technology by Muslims. And he says the essential point which he makes is worthy of our note. And that is that prior to the advent of Quran, the human attitude toward nature was that of fear and awe, as a result of which they will start worshipping anything that benefited them or that threatened their life. There might be bulls or cows to be worshipped because they were very instrumental in agriculture field or in any other, you can say, field like nutrition. Or it will threaten, like for example, snake or monkeys, which will be nuisance. So, or objects of nature like mountains, rivers, the river Ganges, and several other examples like that, the mountain tops. So they used to be worshipped both in Greece, Rome on the western side, and the Indian mythology on the other side. So you see that. James Burke makes the point that it was the insistence in the Quran, the fact that, look, you human beings, you readers of this particular reader, the Quran simply means reader, right? Read this and try to look at nature from the perspective of a student, as a learner, so that you can understand the symbols and signs of my presence, God says. And you can understand me and my laws, natural laws, as well as social commands or spiritual commands, only when you can look inside yourself and look around yourself. And if you look around yourself, you should look around yourself from the perspective of learning and from the perspective of study. And study nature. Don't be afraid of nature. You study nature and try to discover laws, natural laws, and then try to use those natural laws for the benefit of humanity in developing science and technology. And that was the time when Muslim scholars started looking at nature from the perspective of observation. And that observation method, a scientific method, was given and in actual fact was first formulated and presented to the world by an Arab by the name of Ibn Hazm, H-A-Z-M, Ibn Hazm. And it was Ibn Hazm who inspired Roger Bacon, the grandfather of Francis Bacon of the Renaissance period. And it was erroneously attributed to the name of Roger Bacon that observation method or scientific method was given to the world by Roger Bacon. That was an erroneous historical mistake. And because he himself in actual fact admits in the preface to his own book, Understanding Science, that he has learned this from the Arab masters. And these Arab masters in actual fact were the ones who were busy at that particular time, prior to that, for several centuries, in the establishment of institutions of higher learning all over of North Africa and the Muslim lands and in Spain. And it was the universities of Cordoba, the University of Toledo, University of Seville in Spain, that were the prototypes of the universities established in France, the University of Paris. And after that, toward the end of the 12th century, you have Oxford University and Cambridge University patterned on the University of Paris. These are historical facts, and you can check them out in Encyclopedia Americana, Encyclopedia Britannia, and you don't have to look at anything written by Muslims. You look at these sources themselves. At this stage, I would like to share that segment which can serve a kind of transition from what I'm going to talk about, the specific contributions of Muslims, and that's a very good introduction to that. And I'm just showing you only that segment about in which the commentator, the American commentator from Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., talks about the contribution of Muslims to science and technology. Inshallah.
Distinguish this from the Shiite religious tradition.
Most Muslims care little for the distinction between Sunni and Shia. They are linked by a common bond. A bond that is visible in the eternal round, seasonal and communal, of living on this planet. is the daily, seamless reality that the faith helps define. The underlying patterns of nature out here are the real. They reflect the presence of the Creator. So a rational response to the world, according to Islam, is to pry beneath its surface, to codify its patterns, its meaning. An infinite series of repetitions, akin to the crystalline structure that underlies matter. What began as religion led to very sophisticated science. The search for patterns gave us abstraction and ultimately advanced mathematics. Islam brought us algebra and zero. Astronomer Al-Biruni in the 11th century showed how sunlight could eclipse the moon. 500 years before Copernicus and Galileo, Islamic astronomers questioned the Ptolemaic universe they had inherited from the Greeks. It was possible that planets rotated round the sun. Careful star watching, as in these constellations painted in 1009, created elaborate sky maps. Against this background, movements of the planet and sun could be carefully registered, raising questions about the universe. While European medicine was based on notions of humors, Islam's depended on clinical anatomy, the circulatory system, the nervous system, and the skeletal system were charted. Scientific illustration would not be this clear in Europe until 1543, with the medical texts of Vesalius and the solar system of Copernicus. Islam's great contribution was much more than science. The Muslim world had inherited Greek culture. They used it in their everyday lives, applying it, refining it. Their outlook, like ours, was based solidly on observation and philosophy. The ideas of Plato and Aristotle, and with them our whole Renaissance in Europe, could well have been lost had it not been writers. For over 400 years, to be a scholar meant the ability to read Arabic. Some of the books of the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides were written in Arabic here in Cairo. This attitude toward knowledge and the potential of the human mind has always been strong in Islam. In fact, the first word of the Quran as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad was the command to the Muslims, read. So it was Islam which passed the torch of classical civilization to the West. Umar, the second leader after the Prophet Muhammad, concluded a treaty with the Byzantine armies by demanding as part of his tribute 10 volumes of Greek philosophy. Islam was no dark, enclosed creed. The soul's need...
Well, you might have seen at least a few glimpses of the contributions of Muslims to science and technology. Let me go over a few other things which have been casually mentioned or have been omitted by this segment of this tape or this video. I'm giving kind of a summary, and then I'll give some kind of details with the help of some of the transparencies which my brother is going to help me in setting it up. Jazakallah. Thank you very much for being ready for that. Okay, as I said earlier on, that from the Islamic perspective, there is no conflict between reason and revelation. Because Islam believes, the Quran clearly says, that while human beings cannot arrive at the truth about supernatural aspects of life, but any revelations regarding those aspects of life, supernatural life, must be intelligible, must be understandable. It must be consistent with human rationality. And if anything, any commandment or any revelation does not appeal to human reason, either there is something wrong with reason or that is not true revelation. In other words, sooner or later, human beings will be able to devise tools and means of understanding that they will be able to understand those secrets which were in the beginning to some exegetists and some kind of explainers of the Quran were not really as clear as they have become today. And I can just share with you an incident which took place, a kind of dialogue or conversation between Maurice Bucaille on the one hand and his French explorer friend Jacques Cousteau. Jacques Cousteau happened to see the two seas flowing together for miles together without mixing. And he was really flabbergasted by that kind of natural phenomenon. And when he came back from that ocean exploration back to France, he just mentioned that fact to Maurice Bucaille, who had written that book, Bible, Quran, and Science. So he said, that's really very interesting, because this is something which is clearly mentioned in Surah Rahman in the Quran. And it says that in Surah Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala draws the attention of human beings and jinn to obey the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a unique feature of the Quran. It addresses both jinn and human beings and asks them to. So it's a kind of, you can see a kind of sweep of reason that all of us, human beings and all forms of life, animate and inanimate, all beings are the part of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or of the Lord of this universe, the creator of this universe. And it is incumbent on us, human beings, to follow the commandments of God exactly with the same element or amount of obedience which the natural objects do in following the natural laws. So that was the message in the Quran. So that compatibility of reason and revelation is very important aspect, which was responsible for free thinking of individuals, proper use of their mind within the framework of revelation, and the best use of reason, you can say, in making contribution to science and technology. The emphasis on knowledge was also there in a lot of sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you may have heard, I'm sure, that it is incumbent on every moment or believer and male and female to seek knowledge. Seek knowledge even if you have to travel to the farthest place, and at that particular time, farthest place was China. And definitely China was not offering any Islamic education at that particular time. We should be wise enough to understand that it was something to do with mundane worldly education, right? In other words, it is incumbent on the part of Mu'min to find the truth wherever he or she finds that truth, and there should not be any kind of bias against sources, because truth is the lost property of a believer according to the Quran and Hadith. So this emphasis was there, which was imperative for all, and emphasis on, of course, knowledge to be sought by female beings was emphasized most. So Islam is also anti-superstitious. There is a serious conflict between superstition and magic on the one hand, and scientific beliefs on the other. And Prophet ﷺ struck at the very root of superstition and wrong beliefs, you can say, by an incident, if you remember, that when he lost his dear son in infancy by the name of Ibrahim, and some people, out of either sycophancy or their love for Prophet ﷺ, suggested to him that, look, even the nature is crying and is part of your grief in the loss of your son. He was very angry and he rebuked those people. He said that these are natural phenomena and have nothing to do with the ordinary life of a human being like me. So this was a kind of lesson to Muslims, that they are not supposed to believe anything unless they really understand the phenomena, natural phenomena, and they should not believe in superstition. This kind of, there are several different theories with regard to the contribution of Muslims to various walks of life, various disciplines, natural and social. Some people believe that they were only responsible for transferring the knowledge from China, from India, and from Greek to Muslim lands. That is one theory. That's called conduit theory, that they were only a kind of conduit that they were receiving from one end and they were passing it to the other end. The other theory with regard to their contribution is the theory of coordination. They inherited the information from various cultures, and they coordinated that and presented it to the world as if they did not contribute anything. They simply either received it or coordinated it. That is the essence of the second theory. The third theory is that they critiqued it. They inherited it, looked at it, and they critiqued it. But obviously, you cannot critique anything unless you really understand it and you master it. Without the mastery of that, you cannot do that. If you are capable of mastering it, you are capable of creating it too. You are capable of at least adding to that. So the proper understanding of the contributions will be neither conduit, nor coordination, nor critique, but it should be total contribution. Of course, in order for you to make any kind of contribution to anything, you have got to inherit. You have got to coordinate. This is what the modern nations like Britain, France, and America have done. They have inherited a lot, and their keenness to inherit is very clear by a law called American law by the name of PL 480. That is Public Law 480. By Public Law 480, they buy anything published anywhere in the world, and they bring it to their libraries. I was really amazed at the alacrity and the fastness and the richness of the resources which are accumulated in Europe and America, from almost every part of the world. There were some corrupt, you can say, rulers in the Muslim lands who sold these pieces of artifact, these things to British Council and to so many other museums in the West. And you find more sources about the scientific contribution of Muslims in European universities and American universities than you find in one single Muslim country. And if you want to do research in the contribution of Muslims, go to Germany, and you'll find a lot of resources there, original resources, original documents you will find of some of these scientists. So we should understand that they introduced Indian numerals, as it has been mentioned in that segment. The word Hindasa in Arabic is number, and engineering. That is in actual fact is from the word India or Hindi, or Hindasa means something from India. But they did not only inherit that, but they refined that, as the commentator was saying, into something called algebra, and they gave 0 to the word. If you make, you will be able to understand the significance of the introduction of these Arabic numerals to Europe. If you compare, is it possible for you to write the most basic arithmetic formula in Roman numerals? You can't. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. Impossible. So most of the, you can say, contributions of the Greek philosophers were basically speculative. They were armchair kind of researches, use of their mind and intellect, rather than any sophisticated contribution based on numbers or quantitative analysis of data. This quantitative analysis was given by Muslim scholars themselves, which gave algebra, because algebra is considered to be the language of science. Mathematics is considered to be the language of science. The language of linguistics, history, sociology is the language in which it is written. But universal language of science, obviously, is algebra, in which biological sciences, natural sciences, or any kind of sciences, natural sciences can be written. And this would not be possible unless people like Al-Khwarizmi would be able to formulate the basic algebraic formulas. So much so that the word algorithm has been taken from his name. This al-Khwarizmi is the algorithm is the anglicized, distorted form of the name of that Arab philosopher by the name of al-Khwarizmi. So many people will not know that. This is what actually has happened to many names of scholars and scientists, that they have been changed beyond recognition. Muslims themselves mistakenly, erroneously would disown them because they will not recognize them. Like, for example, G-E-B-E-R, Geber, is in actual fact is al-Jabr, right? So this is an Arabic philosopher or Arabic scientist, al-Jabr. And it's in the same way, Avicenna, Avicenna is obviously Buanisina, and Averroes is Ibn Rushd. And there are so many such names which are completely changed. They are beyond recognition. Nobody can know, even Muslims will fail, as I said, to understand them. The establishment of the first modern university was there under the Fatimids. Again, the Shia rulers, Ismaili rulers of Egypt for several hundred years, you can say. These were the people who established Al-Azhar University, the first university in the 9th century. And compare the timing, after 300 years, the first European university in the 12th century is established, the University of Paris, which I mentioned earlier on. So 300 years is a long time. And after that, of course, in the 18th century and 19th century, universities like Yale and Harvard and Princeton were established later on. Al-Azhar became a kind of prototype for Al-Qarawiyyin University in Tunis, and first universities in Europe, as I mentioned, in Cordoba, Toledo, and Seville, etc., were there. As the tape also mentions, the Arabic was the language of all sciences. Anybody who, and any scholar from northwestern European countries like England or France or Germany, if he or she wanted, it was he mostly, not she, even from European countries, if they wanted to seek education in these universities in Spain, Muslim universities, they were known as Moorish universities. The word Moor is also a very misleading term, because Muslims themselves do not know that they were Moroccans. Moors means Moroccans, because they were Muslims who traveled all along the northern part of Africa. They went into Spain through Morocco, all right? The Gibraltar, the Strait of Gibraltar. Gibraltar itself is an Arabic word which is Jabr al-Tariq or Gibraltar. Jabal means the mountain, and Tariq means the person who led the contingent, Muslim contingent, into Spain and burnt the boats before they moved, you can say, inside or in the interior of that. So Gibraltar or Gibraltar is named after him. So Arabic examination, like TOEFL examination, had to be passed by these people if they wanted to start their higher education in that. The study of Arabic for 6 months was a prerequisite before they could start their scientific education in these universities. So as I said, scientific method, and there were so many other innovations based on that scientific method in the field of architecture, civil engineering. And so many innovative agricultural techniques were introduced, and new ways of supply of irrigation, you can say irrigation water, introduction of fruits and new cereals, and different ways of tilling the ground, they were there. Most of the chemical processes which we use today, they in actual fact were found by the chemistry experts or Muslims who were from various parts of the world. They could be Persians, they could be Turkish, they could be some Indians, but those who accepted Islam and they became part of the Ummah, the greater Ummah, they made tremendous contributions from their perspective to the Muslim sciences. Most of the chemical processes, as I said, medical and psychiatric researches were first, from clinical perspective, were conducted by Muslim scientists. And that reminds me, psychiatry itself, first psychoanalysis, was quoted by a Jewish scholar in the history of medical sciences, which I referred to early in the beginning, earlier on. And he says that some young person was brought to Avicenna in English, Avicenna, and all other physicians had failed to cure that young man. So that young man was brought to Avicenna, and Avicenna put his fingers onto the pulse of that young man of 18, 19, young budding fellow, and then he said, all right, what's the problem with this guy? They say, we don't know. We have shown this guy to many people, but this guy shows no sign of recovery. So he said, all right, start naming different cities in front of him. And his fingers were on the pulse of that young man. So that father of that young man was naming some of the cities. He said, this city, that city, etc., etc. And on the name of one city, the pulse picked up, and it was faster. So they said, all right, okay, now in this city, name different neighborhoods. So the father started naming different neighborhoods, and in one neighborhood, the pulse accelerated. And say, all right, now stop here, and then name all the families in this neighborhood. And on the name of one family, there was some kind of acceleration of the pace. And then they'll say, all right, name all the members of this particular family. And on the name of a young, beautiful girl, his pulse got accelerated. And that was a case of love affair between that young man and the girl. So that was the analysis, as it were, psychoanalysis, and found out the real reason of that person's disease. And of course, Freud himself, if he had not introduced pornography into his psychoanalysis, that would be very consistent with the Quranic, idea of different selves, nafs-e ammara, nafs-e mutmainna, nafs-e lawama. All right? These are the three different, very consistent with long time ago, 1500 years ago, or prior to Freud. These things have been mentioned, which now Freud now names them as ego, superego, and id. The idea essentially comes from the Quran itself. So you have seen already the kind of contribution which were made in physiology and anatomy, and how the gap, the historical gap between the Muslim scientists and European scientists was not less than 500 years, right? 500, 600 years. Original research and documentation in biological sciences also took place, and library science, indexing, preservation of books, use of various chemicals in preserving the paper. These were some of the things which were introduced by Muslim scholars. The use of calligraphy and arts in architecture, in business, and proportionate lettering, letter sizing, that from whatever angle you see, you see the same size, and you can read it. It is readable. It might be on the highest point of that building, or it might be the lowest point. You see that, and it looks the same size. And it cannot be the same size. It's not the same size. Proportionate increase with distance was that. You can understand what kind of phenomenal calculations they must have coming up with that kind of calligraphy in that. So critiques of Greek masters was also mentioned there, that it was not only inheriting these ideas or rationality, but sobering the use of rationality. So that you do not you do not have misuse of aql, you have only the proper use of aql or reason. Like, for example, I can ask very strange kind of questions with my logic, human logic, and you will be amazed. You'll say, oh yeah, that sounds rational. But it doesn't make much sense in actual fact, because it's not worth asking those questions. Like, for example, you say, I can accuse, na'udhu billah, I can accuse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for being unjust to me. And I'm using logic in complaining. And I'm saying that, look, how fortunate the frog is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him eyes here. I have to turn all the way down there in order to see backward. And a frog doesn't have to do that. Revolves the eyes very easily. I can complain that octopus is more fortunate. I have been discriminated against with 8 legs there and only 2 legs, and I have to go through such terrible time in trying to walk in my early life. I mean, this is use of logic. But you can understand how distorted this use of logic is. That was the extent of the use of logic, misuse of logic, by the Greek philosophers. And it was that kind of misuse which was challenged. Al-Mu'tazila, with their tradition later on, started following the same kind of misuse of reason. That was precisely the reason why there was some kind of serious debate between the followers of Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali. And ultimately, there was positive points and negative points with regard to the contribution of Muslim science and technology in that debate. And I'll come to that, inshallah, later on. So you have geography and geology contributions by Muslims themselves, like Al-Idrisi, Al-Masudi. Columbus the Great, who discovered America, was carrying a Muslim atlas. He was carrying the atlas by Al-Idrisi. And he, of course, misread that. All right, he couldn't figure out, he was an illiterate person. He may have asked someone to misread that and must have given the wrong direction. All right, father of social sciences and historiography, like Ibn Khaldun, whose contributions to the field of historiography and social sciences are established, very well established in the field. Nobody can question the original contribution of sociology and history and how the science of writing history by Ibn Khaldun. You have rigorous travelogues also written by the people who used to travel thousands of miles in search of knowledge, and they used to write travelogues, very trustworthy travelogues at that time. If you remember, Protestantism itself, try to understand the etymology of the word Protestant movement. Protestant movement definitely is the word derived from protest. And who was protesting? These were the former students of Arabs who used to go to Arab universities in Cairo, in Qayrawan, in Tunis, and in Spanish universities, who used to come there and used to get the idea of free thinking, independence of human mind, you can say, freedom of human mind. And they used to go and complain against Roman Catholic Church and say, what kind of church is that they are shattering the mind or thinking of human beings by denying the access of a laity or layman to Bible. For centuries, Christians were not allowed to read the Bible. It was only allowed to the Pope and the priest and the canonized kind of people. And laity used to be given only a selection from the Bible, a small booklet kind of thing, which was typical of the highest access of laity to the Bible. And Protestant movement under the leadership of Martin Luther was a kind of protest against that kind of restrictive findings or restrictive kind of requirements which were there. Then you have common man's access to knowledge was not allowed, you can say, until Renaissance. Renaissance was nothing in actual fact but a kind of revival of free thought. And that free thought, as you can see, was too free at the time of Greeks. It was made sober under the leadership of Muslims, and I have given you the examples of the misuse of aql. So establishment of Western universities patterned after them, and I have already covered that. What are some of the, I think, details of that? And I would like to ask my brother here to show some of the slides. And I have something for you, which I would like to distribute to each one of you. I hope I have got the right number of copies. If you are unable to see the transparency, please read this and if you quickly look at the time period, on the left-hand side I have listed the time period, and somewhere to the right the name of the scientist and the field of that particular scientist has been listed, and to the extreme right I have listed the contributions of each one of those. You have the period, the 8th century, 721 to 815, where you can imagine historically what the condition of Europe would be at that particular time. You wouldn't even imagine the concept of science in Europe in the 8th century. Jabir ibn Hayyan was Geber, Geber, known in the English books. He was the founder of modern chemistry. And he was a logician, he was a philosopher, and he came up with 3,000 treatises or research documents on Walid ibn Malik. Scientific method, concept and measurement of chemical balance, mechanics and physics, clinical pathology in medicine, and first medical college at Damascus, established with the help of Ibn Hayyan, Jabir ibn Hayyan, and Baitul Hikmah at Baghdad in Iraq was the first medical institution ever established in the human history. During Abbasi period, you have in the 9th century, beginning of 9th century, 801 through 873, you have Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, which is known as Al-Kindus or Al-Kindus. Al-Kindus, sometimes Albert is also written A-L, and sometimes it is confused as somebody Alan Candace. So it is, in actual fact, he is Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, and he is the philosopher and scientist of the Arabs, and he was the precursor of the famous philosopher by the name of Al-Farabi. And he was description of inhabited of the parts of the earth. He was the astronomer and physicist, and he established another observatory by the name of Al-Shamsiyah in Baghdad in Iraq. In global postal system, in Book of Countries was established by Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi was not only an astronomer or a philosopher, but he was also a geographer, and he established actually an administrative system, a postal system at that particular time. His contemporaries is the short form of contemporaries. His contemporaries were Hisham ibn Kalbi and al-Yaqubi, some other scientists who have not been listed here. I have skipped them because if I started listing that, the list would be very thick. And if you are interested, there is a book by the name of History itself, and that history does not do anything except making these 3 columns. And these 3 columns are there: the time period, the name of the person, and the contributions, etc., and some other information about these people. And there are different columns in that history. The whole book is columns. So you can go to that, and for 350 years, you will not find the name of any person except a Muslim as the leader of science for 350 years. All right, so you compare that. Then the 9th century, 810 to 877, you have Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who is known as Huanitius, and nobody will be able to recognize that he was an Arab. He was a physician, a philosopher, and commentator of Galen. Galen was not a Muslim, and he was from the 4th century AD, and a physician, you can say. And his findings, in actual fact, are also known. 826 through 901, Thabit ibn Qurra wrote the volume on paraboloid, 3rd degree figures geometry, and mathematics, physics, medicine, astronomy, theory of trepidation, naval developments, Indian Ocean, Volga, Caspian Sea. All these, in actual fact, were the part of his travelogues or naval explorations at that particular time. He came up with early maps, and his contemporaries were Balakhi and Maqdisi. And in the 9th century, again, in the middle of 9th century, in the period of Abbasi al-Mamun, Khalifa al-Mamun, you have Muhammad al-Khawarizmi, and whose name has been distorted into algorithm, and I have given that here. Algorithmy he used to be called. And the word algorithm, which is a formula, which in the English name is after him. I already said that. Al-Jabr wal-Muqabila, advanced algebra, in actual fact, was given by him. Introduction of Arabic numerals into Europe was done by him. Trigonometrical equations were invented by him. Astronomical tables, he came up with a lot of astronomical tables which you normally find at the end of books as a kind of reference and appendices, and he came up with those, sines, cosines, and so many other things. Geography, the shape of the earth, innovative computations. He was also instrumental in the establishment of Al-Shamsiyah with Nawbakht from Iran. You have the next one, you have again 9th century continued, and beginning of 10th century, Muhammad al-Razi, and his name also has been Europeanized as Raziz, and he came up with 184 works, and he did some kind of clinical finding of smallpox and measles, determined that by scientific method. Clinical physician, Al-Hawi, he wrote the name of the book Al-Hawi, which has been translated into English by the name as Continents. Anti-Aristotelian speculation was criticized by him. Observatory as Al-Raqqa in Shiraz was established by this guy. Emphasis on time, space, and on causality in physics, cause and effect relationship kind of thing, which we try to determine these days, was done by him. As an emphasis on time and space and causality in physics, direct observation of hard data was the practice done by Al-Razi. He was instrumental also in the establishment of observatory at Al-Raqqa, and he worked for that observatory in Shiraz in Iran. Music to alchemy, the relationship between the two, study of Al-Tabari, and the contemporaries were Abul Wafa, Buzjami, the fourth degree equations were invented by him, and Al-Karachi. And the 9th century and 10th century again, Abu Nasr al-Farabi, and his name has been distorted again. You have Al-Farabius. You would say he's a Spanish fellow, but he's not a Spanish fellow, he's a Muslim. A philosopher, commentaries on works of Aristotle, social scientist, first classification of sciences by Al-Farabi, and Ikhwan al-Safa, or Risalat al-Jami. And in the 10th century, Abul Hasan al-Mas'udi, I have mentioned his name as a geographer, travelogues, came up with the meadows of golden mines and gems, talking about the mines, scientific discoveries of various mines in which minerals could be explored, and scientists, historian, anthropologist, geographer, geologist, all that, you can see that. Then the 10th century and 11th century, Abu Ali Sina, which is distorted as Avicenna, and he was a medical scientist and physician, and I have already shared with you the scientific analysis, the psychiatric analysis of that young man. Sheikh al-Rais, he wrote Canon, Al-Qanun, and his translation in various European languages by the name of Canon. Canon is nothing but Al-Qanun, which means in Arabic law. And Kitab al-Shifa, that is cures, the book of cures. And Darul Ilm in Al-Qahira, he established the Observatory of Physics in Hamadan, and scholarly conferences and proceedings were introduced by this guy. Then in the 10th century, 11th century, you have Abu Ali ibn Hazm al-Hazan, was a mathematician, physicist, astrophysicist, medical scientist, and ophthalmologist. And his Kitabul al-Manazir, that is optics which are used in physics, you can say, and in medical sciences, was the establishment of this guy. First eyeglasses made on lathe were done by this guy. Scientific method was, of course, as I have already mentioned, he measured the Nile floods, the timings of those, the measurement of those, and an observatory at Seville and Aflah was established in Spain by him. And spherical and parabolic mirrors were were invented and manufactured by him. Refraction, angles, and velocity of rays through the different kind of concaves and convex lenses, principles of least time, etc. And his contemporaries, Nusayri, Khusro, and Al-Bakri, and his dictionary of geography was also written by him. The next one is, as you can see, is again the 10th and 11th century, Abu Rihan al-Baruni, who was mentioned in the segment there right in the beginning. And his mathematics, he was a mathematician, he was an astrophysicist, a geographer, and geodesy, and Dr. Iqbal Hassan would know better than I do. Historian and anthropologist, and his contemporaries on Aristotle, chronology of ancient nations, Al-Qanun al-Masudi, Al-Qanun, or astrolabes for sailing purposes, motions of the earth, levity and gravity of planets, and elliptical orbits of various, you can say, cosmic bodies were found by him. Then contemporaries were Al-Khazini, who was a physicist and who was responsible for inclination, impetus, and momentum of the various cosmic bodies. Then in the 11th century, early 11th century, you have Abul Qasim al-Majriti, Madrid in Cordoba. He was from Madrid, therefore he was known as that. He came up with the epistles, letters of Ikhwan, and he was a mathematician, a chemist, an astrophysicist, and he observatory at Toledo by the name of Zanqali, he was responsible for the establishment of that observatory. In the 11th and early 12th century, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, or Al-Ghazal, Al-Ghazali was Al-Ghazal, the revivification of religious sciences, was a philosopher and religious scientist. Contemporaries were Mansuri or Nuri hospitals were established by these guys, Al-Idrisi geographers whom I mentioned in the context of Columbus, and he came up with the globe, first globe, and he was a botanist too. The next thing in the 12th century, Rahman al-Khazini, the Greek he was known as, the Scientia versus Sapientia was written by him, and mechanics and hydrostatics were written by him, and centers of gravity and balance of matter and balance of wisdom were related to each other, as the Quran emphasized the obedience of the natural objects and obedience by human beings to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that was the concept here. You have standards of weights were first of all invented by these guys, and where proper measurements emphasized in ayah of Quran that we are supposed to do that, and that was the implementation of some of these things. Then we have the 11th century, 12th century, Abul Fatha Omar Khayyam, who is known as, he was an algebra master, a great mathematician, and he wrote, of course, quatrains, Rubaiyat, Ibn Khayyam, which were translated into English by Fitzgerald, and he was a mathematician, scientist, and a poet. In the 12th century and up to the end of 12th century, Abul Wahid Ibn Rushd, that is Averroes of Cordoba, nobody will be able to recognize him where it is a Muslim. He was Ibn Rushd, is a pure Aristotelian, 38 commentaries on the works of Aristotle he wrote, and he was an expert in medicine, religious law, and comparative studies. In the 13th century, Nasiruddin al-Tusi, universal scientific genius, he was known as, and he was a mathematician, astronomer, and a philosopher. The Tusi couple, they are known as two relatives, and saved libraries from Halaku, the Mongolian who devastated Baghdad, the scientific findings. New planetary models, and I can go on, and that's the last one. You have 13th century and early 14th century, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi. He was a man of medicine, man of geometry and mathematics, astronomy, geography, and philosophy, and how they could combine all that, obviously, because the amount of knowledge was manageable at that time. Now, of course, in every discipline, you have sub-discipline and sub-disciplines, and it is not easy for anyone to master even one subject, let alone many subjects at a time. Commentaries of Qanun by Ibn Sina was written by al-Shirazi, and all these which have been mentioned. 14th century, 15th century, Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun, Kitab al-Ibar, and he was a philosopher of history. I mentioned him in the context of the father of social sciences, father of historiography, and wrote first Al-Muqaddimah, the prologue Logomena, which was translated by Cambridge University into English, and afterwards his own works on history of rise and fall of various cultures were first of all analyzed by this guy. His contemporaries were Kashani and Qazi Zada, who was an inventor of trigonometry. Value of pi was invented by this guy. The observatory established was at Samarkand and Basti in Maridini. In the 16th century and 17th century, in Bahauddin al-Amili and Sheikh al-Islam, application of mathematics and geometry to architecture. He was a mathematician, chemist, and architecture, religious scientist, decimal fractions. Contemporaries were Yazdi and Isfahani. I think at this stage I would stop. I would like to take a sip of water, and thank you very much for this patient listening. And if you have got any questions, I'll be more than glad to answer if I happen to know them. If I do not know, I'll say, I am an ignorant person. I do not know. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siddiqui. It's really a privilege and honor for us to have Dr. Siddiqui with us here. And by the way, I think he speaks more than one language. How many languages do you speak? How many?
Yes.
It's related to the work over here. He speaks 4 languages, so he just uses this knowledge to come up with the Arabic and with the English and with the Persian and so on. So I really appreciate your presence with us tonight. I think I would like to remind you that if you go to KU Pharmacy over here, you will see a picture of a Muslim scientist sitting, writing prescriptions on paper. This is, I've seen it, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, that picture is for Ibn Sina. And this pen here, I guess it's a symbol for the university too. We have Dr. Sayyid Iqbal Hassan with us here. He's Associate Professor, UMKC in Kansas City, and would like to start with him with a few comments from him.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's indeed our pleasure and good fortune to have a scholar like Dr. Siddiqui in our midst. I'm sure that we have learned a lot about the glorious history, our glorious Islamic past. Being a student, young, old, I think it is our mission in life to excel in whatever we are doing, whatever we are studying. Dr. Siddiqui covered the subject in a lot of detail, and I don't think I can do any justice to that, but just as a reminder or elaboration perhaps, he mentioned that Arabic was the language of civilization and indeed of the scientific and technological achievement back in those times. Roger Bacon, he mentioned his name. He has been credited, although erroneously, to have been the discoverer or inventor of many of the traditional scientific thinking methodologies that we are all familiar with now. He himself had to learn Arabic first, and he has admitted it in order to learn from the Islamic scholars. Another interesting point is that in the historical books, Encyclopedia Britannica or any other historical book, there is a reference of dark ages in human civilization. There is a controversy about what exactly spans that dark age, but most people believe that it spans the time frame from about end of 5th century until about 15th century. And as you all know, the very name suggests that the dark ages means that the civilization was in darkness. It may be true for the civilization west of these Islamic seat of knowledge, or perhaps maybe east also. But look what was happening, and he had got a beautiful handout here, which spans the same time frame. And look at the advancement and the extension of the knowledge. The new frontiers were conquered, new knowledges were obtained, and I think it was not a dark age for the entire humanity indeed. It must have been a dark age for a selected section of the world population back in those days, especially the Western civilization, so-called Western civilization. Being a geologist, I have always been interested in the contribution of Muslims, scholars in the field of geology. I cannot go into the detail, obviously, but I want to mention another point which will highlight what has been the thrust of Dr. Siddiqui's lecture here, is that a lot of work that was done by the Islamic or Muslim scientists and scholars back in that time frame, starting from 7th, 8th century on until about 15th, 16th century, that has been erroneously credited to Western scientists. Geology is relatively a new science in all the natural sciences and the basic sciences. It came to be recognized as a separate discipline only toward the end of the 18th century. In fact, a person by name of James Hutton, a British naturalist, he has been credited to be the father of modern geology, and his first work was published in 1786, end of the 18th century. So geology really got to be recognized as a separate discipline back in those times. And one of his famous contribution or doctrine is known as theory of uniformitarianism. There's no need for me to go into that, but as a geologist I was trained to read that and give all the credit to him until just about a year ago. I happened to read some discussion relating to the work of the Islamic scholar, and my eyes got opened that whatever he was giving credit was said and written by somebody 7, 8 centuries, maybe 10 centuries back. There is a person by name of Dr. He's in Michigan, his name is escaping me, but he has started work on that line, and he is bringing these kind of contribution back to the knowledge of everybody. He's written a book, and I believe it's under publication, so inshallah we'll have some more authentic documentation about these facts. A lot of these things are happening around us, and I think as a student, it is a challenge for us and also an inspiration for us to look back to our glorious past. But that's not enough. We have to strive hard, maybe harder, to excel in our own discipline. Whatever we are studying, physics, medicine, computer engineering, biology, humanities, we have to strive harder. And of course, for us, the guidance is in the book of Quran and the Sunnah we have. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. And I just would like to remind you that the Quran also uses or encourage the Muslims to use logic, to stress, in fact, the use of logic. Just as an example, I mentioned to you some statistics. The word don't you think or proof, bring your proof if you are truthful, and so on. Such words, you find it in almost every couple of pages in the Quran. So it's proof is mentioned many places. Don't you think, don't you ponder, think, and so on. All such kind of words and derivatives are full in the Quran. And in fact, the logic in the Quran is a lot. So I just wanted to attract your attention to this fact, and I leave it to you to study it and look at it. And would kindly ask you, if you have any comment or question, to wait until I give you the mic, and then you start. Anybody? I'll start with this side.
Assalamu alaikum.
I think the brother wanted to say something there. No, came forward.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, all right. If you yield, fine.
Yes, that's all right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, all right.
Assalamu alaikum. I have two questions.
Yes.
First of all, what are the reasons for the decline in knowledge and development of science in the Islamic world? The second question is, they say, or a lot of people claim that Greek philosophy was really the motivating factor for the scientific development, and not Islam in itself.
Okay.
If you would like to comment on
All
this.
right.
Thanks.
The first question about the decline itself. In passing, I mentioned during my presentation that when Muslims were on the defensive, their decline started. And the other reason, for example, what exactly happened was in the 12th century, when Mongol invasion took place under Halaku, and of course subsequently by others as well, that gave a very serious psychological shock to the Muslims. And Muslims sought a kind of refuge, majority of them. It doesn't mean that everybody stopped working, but majority of them, the whole community as it were, was negatively affected, adversely affected, psychologically speaking. And they took some kind of refuge into mysticism. And the tradition of mysticism and some sort of concern for securing the faith became of prime importance, rather than exploration of nature and several other things. That was one fact. When the doors of ijtihad, as it were, independent thinking, were closed by those overprotective scholars, and these overprotective scholars followed the other course. One course was the course of diraya in Arabic, which is the course of creativity, innovation, and use of independent thinking. And that was in pursuit of al-Mu'tazila, who were influenced, you can say, by the Greek tradition, Hellenism, and so on, Hellenization of thought. Whereas the other side, which was the majority, they were concerned now that there would be some kind of negative influence of those who were making misuse of their mind, the examples of which I gave. And they became overprotective, you can say. And they started following the other course called Rivaya. So it was a competition between Diraya and Rivaya. Diraya is innovation, creativity, and Rivaya was a kind of tradition. In other words, they started protecting what was already found, and people were not encouraged to add anything to it, but to protect it, to remember it, to document it, and that was considered to be the height of scholarship, to copy in absence of educational technology, in copy of, you can say, when they were afraid of losing these documents. And they were saying, okay, wherever you found some kind of document, the scholars would be busy copying multiple copies of that thing, rather than exploring something independently. So they became, as I said, protective of Rivaya, and that was one of the major reasons. So lack of foresight on the part of some of the scholars, I would say, was one of the major reasons. Second thing, that it was under the influence of the Greeks. They say it was under the influence of Greeks that the misuse of aql started in philosophy. Where would be the influence of those in astronomy or in physics or in chemistry or in biological sciences, in algebra? Where would that be? So obviously that was, according to, as I tend to agree with James Burke, that the inspiration actually originally came from the Quran straight, rather than from Greeks. So it was a kind of threat from the Greeks that religious teachings would be poo-pooed and would be insulted, shall I say. And there were some scholars who had started doing that. So there was some kind of conflict and some kind of fear in the minds of those scholars.
Thank you. I'd like to have the answers a little bit shorter than that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
I am taking course right now. Okay. I am taking course right now called the History of Philosophy and Education, and this course started from the Greek, Plato, Socrates. Then we moved to the China, and then we started with the West, Jean-Locke, then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Dewey, etc. But the course never mentioned about the contribution, what you have said about Islam. So I would like to hear a brief comment from you about the influence of this Islam on the American education and the West education in general.
I mean, there is no other answer except saying that this was kind of bias of some of the writers of the history of various disciplines, that they deliberately ignore the mention of these contributions. You will always find this, that as if everything starts in Greek and in Greece and Rome, and it's all of a sudden it jumps to the Renaissance in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, and it's nothing happened in between. And then if the writer is American, then he comes to America, all right, from Renaissance. It covers the 18th century, and then from then the history of America starts, and nothing else. So, I mean, to relieve that kind of situation, I can simply quote some kind of references in the history of philosophy of education by the name of Mehdi Nakhustin, who wrote 2 volumes which I mentioned, and they were published by the University of Colorado at Boulder. So look for that, Nakhustin, Nakhosteen, and I can give you the fuller reference to that, inshallah. And there are so many other sources.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you very much. You have answered
the first part of my question, which deals with the decline. The second part of the question is, we have all realized that there's a lot of distortion in the history of science, as claimed by Western scientists. What effort are the Islamic scholars doing to correct this erroneous mistake? Okay. Because I think credit should be given to the whosoever deserves it.
Yes. Very good question. Jazakallah. Thank you very much for this. That reminds me of something which I wanted to say and it could have escaped my mind. That is the effort of IIIT, International Institute of Islamic Thought, in Herndon, Virginia. They are doing this thing, and they are recruiting, shall I say, different historians, Muslims, non-Muslims, whosoever wants to work on these projects to do justice, as it were, to history. And they encourage by giving some kind of graduate assistantships, and they also give some kind of funds for these research projects. If you want to come up with some kind of idea or a proposal, then send that proposal and choose a topic for your master's degree thesis or a PhD dissertation, and you will get funded by these people, hopefully, inshallah. And then explore all these resources and come up with the idea of Islamizing knowledge.
And if you need information on how to get a scholarship through this, please talk to me after the lecture. I'll give you the phone number and everything.
Just add a comment in light of what Dr. Siddiqui said. Not only that they will look at your proposal and give you funding if the project is worthy, but also they have got summertime internship program. So if you want to spend your summer on some project, contact them and they will have some funds available to support you during the summer period.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hassan.
And I'll be gone on the summer. If you need to go there, I can give you a ride. Anybody wants to ask any question?
Incidentally, IIIT is also instrumental in supporting professional organizations of Muslims. And they have got AMSS, Association of Muslim Social Scientists, and you should participate in the activities of those. They hold their conferences. The next conference, inshallah, is going to be in October, end of October, the last weekend of October, in the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. So get in touch with me or with Dr. Hassan because AMSE also meets at the same place at the same time. AMSE means Association of Muslim Scientists and Engineers. And at the same time, you have got the third one, Association of Muslim Physicians and Doctors and Physical Sciences, something like that. I'm not really very positive about the name of that organization. All three are the sister organizations, and they are supported by Islamic Society of North America and IIIT. That is International Institute of Islamic Thought. Okay, inshallah. And we do need the help and interest of not only Muslim scholars, it is imperative on them, but very judicious-minded non-Muslim scholars also, who are interested in doing justice to these distortions, must come forward and it can be funded, you can say, by these sources. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. How do you foresee the future of the Muslim world in the field of research, science, and technology?
You have to do a lot of catching up. The answer to that is that Muslims are 25 to 30% of the total population of the world. Close to about slightly over 1 billion people subscribe to Islam. And their contribution in modern times to science has been less than 1%. So it is imperative on our part to do something about that. The earlier we do it, faster we do it, the better it is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you.
Thank you.
I just have to make a comment. It has something to do with what the gentleman said. And he said, he was asking you what the scholars are doing right now to make a difference of the distortions, about Islam. I just wanted to say that each one of us can make that difference. We don't have to rely on any scholars or anyone. If you know what you're talking about, just get some knowledge, read, study. And we've gotten a golden chance here. We get to meet non-Muslims every day. It's an excellent chance for us. Just get to know some stuff and go talk to everyone. We're a great civilization. You should be proud of it. You should.
Allahu Akbar. Very good.
That's what I wanted to say. There are lots of things we do that might look kind of weird, among the other people. But, there's a reason for everything we do.
Exactly.
Know those reasons, tell everyone why we do it. We should be proud of what we are.
Good. Thank you. Very good. Yeah.
And I think we would like to conclude because the building has to be closed at 10 o'clock. So we want to give you enough time to talk and talk to one another before we conclude. At the end, we would like to thank Dr. Siddiqui for this interesting lecture we had tonight. I would like to thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you in the next few days with Sister Nancy Ali. She's going to talk about women issues, the position of women in Islam. Sister Nancy Ali was a former nun and she converted to Islam. And she was here before, but this time she's going to be speaking on her experience as a Muslim woman. So I hope, inshallah, to advertise and tell you about the time and the place later, inshallah. Thank you all, and we'll see you in the next program. Assalamu alaikum.
All of them, whatever you have it. This is my interest. I keep collecting. Yeah, that's fine. Okay.